Hi, I grew up in Singapore, where we faced a largely competitive environment. Oh, the wonder of meritocracy. This left no room for failure, expectations were high, and I only accepted success. When I was young, my parents always wanted me to get top grades and to receive many piano certificates. I remember I used to play the piano, and I would cry and cry until tears fell onto the keys became slippery, and I played like Mozart. When I was 18, I went for an assessment round. I'm sure many of you LSE students can identify with endless assessment rounds. In there, an essay asked me, "What is your greatest setback in life?" That hit me. What was my greatest setback in life? Who would possibly want to remember their greatest failure? That was where I realized I never really failed at all. No, don't get me wrong. I never failed at all because I was one who never dared to try new things. When I was young, I've always wanted to be a fashion designer. I've always wanted to set up my own company and to be on Project Runway. However, this did not happen because I was just scared of failure. My biggest fear was the fear of failure. I'm sure everyone has been stopped from the achievement of success because they were scared to fail. Didn't you realize that in itself is a failure? Now that I'm 21, I've learned the best way to overcome this fear is through taking baby steps and making your heart feel motivated. Sometimes, to start something, I would close my eyes and count down to 0 because this would take my mind off any worries that I have, and I would just go in for it. As social media would call it, #YOLO. Remember, you don't have to be great to start, but you have to start to be great. Failure is not something you should be afraid of. Failure is a story worth telling. Off the record, stories untold. Behind every success story, the greatest story untold is failure. On the record, J.K. Rowling produced one of the best series of all time, the Harry Potter series. Off the record, what people don't know is that she got rejected by 12 different publishers. Can you imagine J.K. Rowling having to plead with publishers to release her first book? Now, I'd like to invite you to ask yourselves, what is your greatest failure? All right, my failures made me who I am today. In my opinion, failure brings confidence, whereas success only brings complacency. It sounds ironic, doesn't it? Think about it. Back to my essay, I had my answer. When I was 13, I had a terrible stuttering problem. Won't you detest me if I spoke something like this? Right, I'm exaggerating, but you get the point. I had a huge lack of confidence. I was murmuring and looking down all the time. I couldn't make proper conversation. I couldn't complete my sentences. I went through a school year alone and afraid. I even contemplated suicide. My parents wanted to send me for counseling because I just never dared to talk to anyone else. I was always locking myself up in my room. What did I do? Did I embrace failure well? Now, there are only 2 responses you can have to failure. First is when you don't accept it. You enter the stage of denial, where you run away from all that has happened. You pretend it never once happened. Another form of denial can be you starting to blame others or your circumstance for your mistake. For example, if it hadn't been for LSE 100, I would have gotten a first. Everyone is guilty of this, where failures in relationships always leads to, well, he's not worth it, or she's a jerk. The idea is failure can never be your fault. Sometimes we convince ourselves our mistakes don't matter. This is called hedonic editing. We utilize every effort we can to find some good in our failure, such that we don't take any lesson away from it. It's about drawing a line and lowering your expectations under a decision you already regret, just to make yourself feel happy. For example, let's say you're applying to university and you apply to the best school in the world, the LSE. When you get rejected because of all the wonderful applicants sitting in front of me here today, you tell yourself, well, maybe I don't want to go to a school of this standard. Maybe I'll just be happy going to a school of this standard. And then you go to UCL. However, do you really feel good about yourself? Do you really want to go to UCL instead of LSE? The other outcome is for you to accept it. You recognize it. You gather feedback from your peers, determine what made you fail, and then you move on. It sounds obvious, isn't it? But most people don't know or don't want to go about doing this. The most important step is to be objective. You take emotions out of the equation. Many a time, pride gets in the way of things. Just humble yourselves and accept that you are this ugly. No, I'm just kidding. Humble yourselves and just accept that failure does happen and you could have done something to avoid it. Humility is the best value in failure. It's about how you work on it that matters. As Elma said just now, the best way to conquering failure is working within your strength zone, but outside of your comfort zone. Back when I served the army, I went for a jungle navigation course in the deep primary forests of Brunei. What I learned was that I hated backtracking. Whenever we would go off course, I would always devise a new route forward. What could have been a small failure in navigation led to us getting stuck in deep ditches, nearly falling off cliffs to our very deaths as we went way off course. This was my failure. What did I do? I first recognized it. And I was good at recognizing. I was contemplative. I learned that I hated backtracking because efforts invested would go to waste. However, what I didn't know was that if I had navigated blindly, more efforts would be wasted. So though I felt uncomfortable, I trained myself to always look at the bigger picture, to analyze situations not based on past efforts, but on the current scenario. I then went on to be a tank commander apt in the skills of navigation. On top of accepting failure, I realized there was one thing that could be my greatest strength. Failure becomes my motivation. Who likes to fail over here? Well, I don't. However, being so good at failure made me not only accept failure, but I could take that failure and transform it into motivation. When failure happens, I don't look at spilled milk and cry. I say, all right, failure, let's play it your way. My dad contracted meningitis when we were on holiday in Paris just before I came to LSE. It badly affected me, watching the way the bacteria ravaged away at his brain, leaving him in such a terrible state. In every minute, I prayed to God that I was the one suffering instead of him. This was not a failure of my own. This was a setback of my circumstance. My initial failure was that I let this consume me. Imagine receiving the news halfway through a rag party that he had almost reached brain death. This loss was greater than any failure I could have encountered. The loss of a loved one is something I cannot comprehend, and it was just too soon for him to go. So what did I do? No. I didn't roll into a little ball, cry, and quit school. I took this failure and I transformed it into motivation. Despite a shaky start to school and my family situation back home, I strove to excel and overcome in school and the societies that I joined. In my first term, I had the privilege of writing for the Beaver, achieving a distinction in an investment competition, setting up a homeless project here based in London, traveling to 7 different cities over different weekends, and now proudly chairing the Asian Investment Banking Conference 2016. What I'm trying to say is that failure is what you make of it. Don't let circumstance change you. You change the circumstance. Each time the thought of a hospital bed flashed by my head, I know I'm doing whatever I'm doing now to please my dad. My dad is my motivation, so that wherever he may be, he will be able to say, "John, I am proud of you." To wrap up, a senior once told me that you need to fail. Failures don't just come to pass, they shape you. I've attained successes in my life, but it's only through failure that has shown me its sweet taste. Don't give up on what you're doing, because you can never anticipate failure. Failure, after all, makes for a story worth telling. Back to my greatest failure. I took stuttering into my own hands. I did my research. I read books on smiling, on body gestures, and on accents. I talked to the mirror for hours at a time, practicing hand motions I was not used to, but so much to a point that it became habitual. I tried fake accents in my tone, and my stuttering disappeared after a few months. Hence, with no prior experience, with huge nerve swelling and probably a butterfly farm in my stomach, here I am, presenting myself confidently to tell you here today that failure can be your greatest success. Thank you.